The black volcanic sand burned beneath Private First Class Ira Hayes' boots. As he crouched behind a shell-torn boulder, the acrid smell of sulfur and gunpowder filling his nostrils. It was February 19th, 1945, and the young Pima Indian from Arizona had never imagined hell could be so real. Mount Suribachi loomed before him like a sleeping giant, its slopes honeycombed with Japanese fortifications that seemed to spit death with every breath. The pre-dawn bombardment had been deafening. 7 to 4 days of naval shelling followed by air strikes that should have turned the island into lifeless rubble. Yet as the first waves of Marines from the 4th and 5th Marine Division stormed the beaches of Iwo Jima, they discovered that Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had transformed this 8-square-mile island into an impregnable fortress. The Japanese commander had spent months preparing for this moment, constructing an intricate network of underground tunnels, concrete bunkers, and artillery positions that could withstand the heaviest Allied bombardment. Hayes pressed himself deeper into the volcanic rock as machine gun fire raked the position where he had been standing moments before. Around him, Marines from Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, 28th Marine Regiment were pinned down by crossfire from hidden positions. The beach behind them was littered with the wreckage of landing craft and the bodies of Marines who had made it only yards inland before being cut down by the devastating offensive fire. Corporal Harlan Block, a tough farm boy from Texas, crawled up beside Hayes, his face streaked with black sand and sweat. "This ain't like Bougainville," he shouted over the din of battle, referencing their previous Pacific campaign. "These Japs are dug in deeper than ticks on a hound dog." Block had been Hayes' closest friend since boot camp at Paris Island, and his easy humor had carried them both through the brutal island-hopping campaign. Across the Pacific, the strategic importance of Iwo Jima could not be overstated. Located just 660 miles from Tokyo, the island served as an early warning station for Japanese defenders and a base for fighter planes that harassed American B-29 bombers on their missions to the Japanese mainland. For the Allies, capturing Iwo Jima would provide emergency landing strips for damaged bombers and eliminate the constant threat to their strategic bombing campaign, as referenced in wartime dispatches from Associated Press correspondent Robert Sheridan, who was embedded with the assault forces. The initial landing had been met with surprisingly light resistance. The Japanese had allowed the first waves to come ashore before unleashing their carefully coordinated defense. Now, as the Marines attempted to advance inland, they discovered the true nature of Kuribayashi's strategy, a defense in depth that would exact a terrible price for every yard of volcanic soil. Sergeant Michael Strank, a veteran of the Guadalcanal campaign, moved among his men with the calm efficiency of a born leader. The Pennsylvania-born Marine had earned his stripes the hard way, through months of jungle fighting in the Solomon Islands. Now, faced with an entirely different kind of warfare, he adapted his tactics to meet the challenge. "Keep your heads down and watch for spider holes," he called out to his squad. The Japanese had perfected the art of camouflaged fighting positions, and Marines were falling to enemy fire from directions they thought were secure. The morning sun climbed higher over the sulfur-stained landscape, casting long shadows across the battlefield. In the distance, Mount Suribachi dominated the southern end of the island, its slopes already scarred by shell fire, but still bristling with hidden guns. Hayes could see other Marine units advancing up the beach, their progress measured in yards rather than miles. The 4th Marine Division was pushing toward the center of the island, while the 5th Marine Division prepared for the assault on Suribachi itself. As the first day of battle drew to a close, the Marines had established a precarious foothold on Iwo Jima, but at a cost that would have been unimaginable just hours before. The volcanic island was proving to be everything American intelligence had feared and more, a fortress that would demand the ultimate sacrifice from those who sought to take it. By February 21st, the sulphurous air around Mount Suribachi had grown thick with the smoke of battle and the cries of wounded Marines. Private Franklin Sousley, barely 19 years old, moved through the volcanic landscape with the nervous energy of youth. Tempered by 2 days of brutal combat, the Kentucky farm boy had joined the Marines seeking adventure and glory. But the reality of war on Iwo Jima was stripping away such naive notions with each passing hour. Colonel Harry Liver Sedge, commanding officer of the 28th Marine Regiment, had been given the task of isolating and capturing Mount Suribachi. The extinct volcano rose 546 feet above the Black Beaches, and from its summit, Japanese observers could direct artillery fire across the entire island until Suribachi fell. No Marine position would be truly secure. The Japanese defenders, commanded by Colonel Kanehiko Atsuchi, had transformed the mountain into a fortress of concrete and steel. More than 2,000 enemy soldiers occupied a network of caves, tunnels, and bunkers that had taken months to construct. Machine gun nests commanded every approach, while mortar teams hidden deep within the mountain could rain death on attackers with impunity. Asuchi had vowed to make the Americans pay dearly for every foot of ground. Sousley found himself part of a combat patrol probing the mountain's defenses, alongside Corporal Block and Private Hayes. The three Marines had formed an unlikely bond during their training at Camp Pendleton. The Kentucky farm boy, the Texas football player, and the quiet Pima Indian. Now they moved as one unit, each man watching the other's backs as they navigated through the maze of shell craters and debris that littered the mountain's base. The attack on Suribachi began with another massive bombardment. Battleships offshore opened up with their 16-inch guns, while Marine artillery units established on the beach added their voices to the barrage. The mountain shook under the impact, sending cascades of volcanic rock tumbling down its slopes. Yet when the shelling lifted and the Marines began their advance, the Japanese positions came alive once more, proving that even the heaviest bombardment could not dislodge a determined enemy from such formidable defenses. Private Rene Gagnon, a mill worker from New Hampshire, served as a runner for the battalion headquarters, carrying messages and ammunition to the forward units. The young Marine had volunteered for the dangerous duty, partly to prove himself to his fellow Marines and partly because he genuinely believed in the cause they were fighting for. As he moved through the battlefield, dodging sniper fire and mortar rounds, Gagnon witnessed firsthand the incredible courage of the Marines around him. The fighting was unlike anything the Marines had experienced in previous Pacific campaigns. On other islands, Japanese defenders had often launched suicidal banzai charges that, while terrifying, at least revealed the enemy's position. On Iwo Jima, the Japanese had adopted a new strategy of defense in depth, fighting from concealed positions and withdrawing only when their positions became untenable. This meant that ground thought to be secure could suddenly erupt with enemy fire as Japanese soldiers emerged from hidden spider holes and tunnels. By the end of the second day, the 20th Regiment had managed to advance only a few hundred yards up the mountain's slopes. Casualties were mounting at an alarming rate. Young Marines who had trained together, fought together, and dreamed of going home together were falling to an enemy they could rarely see. Yet despite the horrific losses, morale remained high. These were Marines, and they had a job to do. Mount Suribachi would fall, no matter the cost. The morning of February 23rd dawned gray and overcast, with low clouds clinging to the peak of Mount Suribachi like smoke from a funeral pyre. Private First Class Hayes checked his rifle for the 100th time, the familiar ritual providing some comfort in the chaos that surrounded him. For days of continuous combat had reduced Easy Company to barely half its original strength. Yet the Marines pressed on with grim determination. Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson, commanding the 2nd Battalion, had received word that a patrol might be able to reach the summit of Suribachi. The Japanese resistance, while still fierce, seemed to be weakening after days of relentless pressure from Marine assault teams. Johnson selected a 40-man patrol led by 1st Lieutenant Harold Schreier to make the attempt. Among the volunteers were Hayes, Block, Sousley, Strank, and Gagnon, 5 Marines whose names would soon become synonymous with one of the war's most enduring images. The patrol began its ascent in the pre-dawn darkness, moving carefully through terrain that had been contested yard by bloody yard. Over the previous 3 days, Sergeant Strank, now acting as patrol leader after several officers had been wounded, guided his men along a route that offered the best cover from Japanese observation posts. Higher up the mountain, the Marines moved in single file, each man responsible for watching a specific sector of fire. The silence was unnerving. After days of constant battle, the relative quiet felt ominous rather than reassuring. Japanese defenders were still present in the mountain's tunnels and caves, but their resistance had become increasingly sporadic. Some Marines wondered if they were walking into a trap, while others hoped that the enemy had finally been worn down by the relentless American pressure. As the patrol climbed higher, the view of the surrounding battlefield became increasingly sobering. The beaches below were littered with the wreckage of the landing, destroyed landing craft, abandoned equipment, and the crosses of a rapidly expanding cemetery where Marine dead awaited their final journey home. In the distance, the rest of the island remained contested ground, with other Marine units still fighting for every hilltop and ravine against Japanese defenders who showed no signs of surrender. Private Sousley found himself thinking of his mother back in Kentucky. As he climbed the volcanic slopes, before shipping out to the Pacific, he had promised her that he would come home safely. a promise that now seemed increasingly difficult to keep. The young Marine had seen too many good men fall over the past for days, friends who had made similar promises to their own families, and would never have the chance to keep them. Around mid-morning, the patrol reached a point just below the summit where they could see the rim of the volcanic crater. Japanese resistance had dwindled to occasional sniper fire and the distant sound of fighting from other parts of the mountain. Lieutenant Schreier made the decision to push forward to the very top, where they could plant an American flag and signal to the rest of the Marine force that Mount Suribachi had finally fallen. The final approach to the summit was tense, but relatively unopposed. As the Marines crested the rim of the crater, they found themselves looking down into a bowl-shaped depression that showed clear signs of Japanese occupation, abandoned equipment, dugouts, and the entrance to tunnels that led deep into the mountain's interior. More importantly, they were now standing on the highest point of southern Iwo Jima, with commanding views in all directions. Lieutenant Schreier had carried a small American flag with him during the ascent, and at approximately 10:20 in the morning, he and several other Marines attached it to a piece of Japanese pipe they had found among the debris. The flag was modest in size, barely large enough to be seen from the beaches below, but its symbolism was immense. For the first time since the landing began, the stars and stripes flew over Japanese territory that had been captured through American blood and sacrifice. Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal had been documenting the brutal battle for Iwo Jima since the initial landing, his camera capturing images that would help the American public understand the savage nature of Pacific warfare. On the morning of February 23rd, Rosenthal received word that a Marine patrol had successfully reached the summit of Mount Suribachi and raised an American flag. Sensing the historic nature of the moment, he began the treacherous climb up the mountain's slopes, determined to photograph the symbol of American victory. By early afternoon, word had reached Colonel Johnson at the battalion command post that a larger flag was needed, one that could be seen clearly from across the island and from the ships offshore. The original flag raised by Lieutenant Schreier's patrol was too small to serve as an effective rally point for the Marines still fighting in other sectors of the island. Johnson dispatched Sergeant Strank with a patrol carrying a much larger flag, measuring 8 feet by 4 feet 8 inches, that had been acquired from the USS Missoula. The second patrol included the same Marines who would become immortalized in Rosenthal's photograph: Sergeant Strank, Corporal Block, Private First Class Hayes, Private Sousley, Private Gagnon, and Navy Hospital Corpsman Second Class John Bradley. Each man had his own reasons for volunteering for what seemed like a routine mission, to replace one flag with another. None could have imagined that they were about to participate in one of the most famous moments in American military history. Hospital Corpsman Bradley had been treating wounded Marines throughout the battle for Suribachi, moving between aid stations and forward positions with a calm dedication that marked the Navy medical personnel serving with Marine units. The Wisconsin native had already earned the respect of the Marines he served with through his willingness to risk his own life to save others. His presence on the flag-raising patrol was typical of the man. He went wherever Marines needed medical support. As Rosenthal reached the summit, he found the Marines preparing to raise the second flag while simultaneously lowering the first one. The photographer positioned himself carefully, knowing that he would have only one chance to capture the moment. The wind whipped across the crater rim, making it difficult to set up his equipment properly, but Rosenthal had learned to work quickly under combat conditions. The 6 men gathered around the flagpole, actually a length of Japanese water pipe that had been scavenged from the debris. Scattered across the summit, Sergeant Strank coordinated the effort, his natural leadership abilities evident even in this simple task. The other Marines positioned themselves around the base of the pole, ready to help push it upright when Strank gave the command. At approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the Marines began raising the flag. The large banner caught the wind immediately, snapping out in the breeze that swept across the mountaintop. Rosenthal, crouched behind his camera, captured the moment when the 6 Marines were pushing the pole upright, their bodies straining against the weight and the wind resistance. The photographer wasn't entirely certain he had captured the moment properly. The action had happened quickly, and the wind had made it difficult to frame the shot exactly as he wanted. It wasn't until several days later, when the film was developed and transmitted back to the United States, that the true impact of the image became apparent. The photograph showed 6 American servicemen working together to raise their nation's flag over conquered enemy territory, their bodies forming a composition that seemed to embody the spirit of American determination and sacrifice. What Rosenthal had captured was more than just a routine military operation. It was a moment that would come to symbolize American resolve. In the face of seemingly impossible odds, the image would eventually appear on war bomb posters, postage stamps, and countless other items, becoming perhaps the most recognizable photograph of World War II. More importantly, it would serve as a lasting tribute to the Marines who fought and died on the volcanic slopes of Iwo Jima. The flag that now flew proudly from Mount Suribachi's peak could be seen across the entire battlefield, serving as a beacon of hope for Marines still locked in deadly combat throughout the island. However, the capture of the mountain represented only the beginning of the struggle for Iwo Jima. The main Japanese defensive positions lay in the island's interior, where General Kurobayashi had prepared his most formidable fortifications. Sergeant Strank led his men back down the mountain with quiet satisfaction, knowing they had accomplished their mission. The 24-year-old Marine from Pennsylvania had proven himself a natural leader during the Pacific Campaign, and his men trusted him implicitly. None of them realized that within days, 3 of the 6 flag raisers would be dead, victims of the continuing battle that would rage for another month. The Japanese response to the flag raising was swift and deadly. Artillery fire began falling on the summit almost immediately as enemy observers from other parts of the island directed their guns toward the now obvious American position. The Marines on Suribachi quickly learned to keep their heads down and stay away from the crater rim, where Japanese snipers still held concealed positions in the mountain's extensive cave system. Private Sousley found himself thinking more and more about home as the battle continued. The Kentucky farm boy had been writing letters to his mother whenever possible, trying to reassure her that he was safe while carefully avoiding any mention of the horrific casualties his unit was suffering. In his most recent letter, written just before the flag raising, Sousley had expressed confidence that the war would soon be over and that he would be home in time for the harvest season. The strategic situation on Iwo Jima remained precarious. Despite the symbolic victory on Mount Suribachi, the Japanese had constructed 3 main defensive lines across the island's interior, each one designed to exact maximum casualties from attacking American forces. Pillboxes, bunkers, and underground tunnels created a maze of interlocking fields of fire that made every advance a costly proposition. Hospital Corpsman Bradley continued his exhausting work treating wounded Marines, moving between aid stations and forward positions with supplies of morphine, bandages, and the quiet courage that marked the Navy medical personnel serving with Marine units. The corpsman from Wisconsin had already seen enough wounded and dying young men to last several lifetimes, yet he never hesitated when Marines needed medical attention. On March 1st, just 6 days after the famous flag raising, tragedy struck the men who had shared that moment of triumph. Sergeant Strank was killed by enemy artillery fire while directing his squad's advance against a Japanese strong point. The loss of the leader was devastating to the Marines who had served under him, but there was no time to mourn. The battle for Iwo Jima continued with relentless intensity. 3 days later, on March 4th, Private Sousley fell to sniper fire while advancing across open ground. During an assault on Japanese positions in the island's interior, the young Marine from Kentucky died instantly, his dreams of returning home for the harvest season ending on the volcanic soil of Iwo Jima. His mother would receive the news of his death just days after learning about his participation in the flag-raising ceremony. Corporal Block met his fate on March 21st, killed by enemy mortar fire during the final phases of the battle for the island. The Texas Marine had survived the entire Pacific campaign only to fall when victory was almost within grasp. His death, like those of Strank and Sousley, served as a reminder that the famous photograph represented not just a moment of triumph, but also a symbol of the ultimate sacrifice made by so many young Americans. The battle for Iwo Jima finally ended on March 26th. After 36 days of some of the most brutal fighting in the Pacific War, American casualties totaled over 28,000, including nearly 7,000 dead. Japanese losses were even higher, with virtually the entire garrison of over 20,000 men fighting to the death rather than surrender. The strategic value of the island would prove significant in the final months of the war, but the human cost had been almost beyond comprehension. Private First Class Ira Hayes stood on the deck of the transport ship, carrying him away from Iwo Jima, watching the volcanic island fade into the Pacific haze. The Pima Indian from Arizona was one of only 3 survivors from the famous flag-raising photograph, and the weight of that survival pressed heavily on his shoulders. Around him, other Marines were celebrating their departure from what many called the toughest battle in Marine Corps history. But Hayes felt no joy in leaving behind the place where so many of his friends had died. The news of the iconic photograph had reached the United States while the battle was still raging, and the image had already become a powerful symbol of American determination. War bond drives across the country were using the photograph to encourage citizens to buy bonds to support the war effort, and the faces of the 6 Marines had become familiar to millions of Americans. However, 3 of those faces now belonged to young men who would never return home. Private Rene Gagnon, the mill worker from New Hampshire, had also survived the battle, though he carried physical and emotional scars that would last a lifetime. During the weeks following the flag raising, Gagnon had continued his duties as a runner, carrying messages between units and supplies to forward positions. He had seen the worst of the fighting on Iwo Jima and had somehow emerged alive, when so many others had not. Hospital corpsman John Bradley, the 3rd survivor, had been wounded by shrapnel from a Japanese mortar round while treating casualties. During the final weeks of the battle, the Navy medic from Wisconsin had earned the Navy Cross for his heroic actions in treating wounded Marines under fire, but he rarely spoke of his wartime experiences. Like many combat veterans, Bradley preferred to focus on the future rather than dwell on the horrors he had witnessed. The 3 survivors were soon ordered back to the United States to participate in the 7th War Bond Tour, a nationwide campaign designed to raise money for the continuing war effort. The tour would take them to cities across America, where they would speak to crowds about their experiences and encourage citizens to buy war bonds. For Hayes, who had grown up on a reservation in Arizona and had never been comfortable in large crowds, the prospect of public appearances was almost as terrifying as combat had been. The Bond Tour began in April of 1945, just weeks after the end of the battle for Iwo Jima. Hayes, Gagnon, and Bradley found themselves thrust into a world of publicity and public attention that none of them had sought or wanted. They were treated as heroes, but each man struggled with the knowledge that their survival had been largely a matter of luck, rather than heroism. The real heroes, they knew, were the Marines who had died on the volcanic slopes of Mount Suribachi and throughout the island's interior. During their appearances, the 3 Marines were asked to recreate the flag-raising scene using a replica of Mount Suribachi, constructed for the tour. The spectacle felt hollow to men who had seen the reality of war, but they understood the importance of their mission in supporting the ongoing fight against Japan. The money raised by the Bond Tour would help fund the final phases of the Pacific War and potentially save the lives of other American servicemen, as referenced in contemporary accounts from Time magazine correspondents covering the Bond Tour. The public response to the 3 Marines was overwhelming. Americans were hungry for heroes and symbols of hope as the war entered its final phase, and the flag raisers represented both victory and sacrifice in a way that resonated deeply with the home front. However, the pressure of constant public attention began to take its toll on men who had already endured more than most people could imagine. Hayes, in particular, struggled with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Though such terms were not yet part of the common vocabulary, the quiet Pima Indian had lost too many friends on Iwo Jima and found it difficult to accept praise for what he considered simply doing his duty as a Marine. The war in the Pacific ended on September 2, 1945, with Japan's formal surrender aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. For the 3 surviving flag raisers, victory brought both relief and a complex mixture of emotions. They had lived to see the end of the conflict that had claimed so many of their friends, but they also faced the challenge of returning to civilian life carrying memories that would never fully fade. Ira Hayes returned to the Gila River Indian Reservation in Arizona, hoping to find peace in the familiar desert landscape of his childhood. However, the transition to civilian life proved difficult for the war veteran. The public attention he had received during the Bond Tour had made him uncomfortable, and he struggled with survivor's guilt over the deaths of his friends. Hayes worked various jobs and battled with alcoholism, a struggle that would continue for the rest of his life. Rene Gagnon went back to New Hampshire and eventually found work in a textile mill, the same type of job he had held before the war. The former Marine married and started a family, trying to build a normal life despite the fame that had come with being part of the iconic photograph. Gagnon rarely spoke publicly about his wartime experiences, preferring to focus on providing for his family and moving forward with his life. John Bradley returned to Wisconsin, where he used the GI Bill to attend college and eventually became a funeral director. The former Navy corpsman married his girlfriend, whom he had corresponded with throughout the war, and raised a family like the other survivors. Bradley was reluctant to discuss his wartime service and rarely mentioned his participation in the flag raising to his children. The photograph taken by Joe Rosenthal continued to grow in significance long after the war ended. The image became the model for the Marine Corps' War Memorial in Arlington, Virginia, dedicated in 1954 as a tribute to all Marines who had died in service to their country. The memorial, created by sculptor Felix D. Weldon, captured the spirit of the original photograph while serving as a permanent reminder of the sacrifices made during the Pacific War. In 1949, the story of the flag raisers was brought to Hollywood in the film Sands of Iwo Jima, starring John Wayne. While the movie took considerable dramatic license with the actual events, it helped cement the flag raising as one of the defining moments of American military history. The 3 survivors served as technical advisors for the film, though they remained uncomfortable with the attention their story continued to receive. The true cost of victory on Iwo Jima became clear only as historians examined the battle's impact on both sides. The Japanese garrison had been virtually annihilated, with over 20,000 defenders killed during the 36-day battle. American casualties exceeded 28,000, including nearly 7,000 killed in action. The strategic value of the island was significant. It served as an emergency landing site for B-29 bombers and eliminated a threat to American air operations, but the human price had been enormous. As the decades passed, the surviving flag raisers dealt with their wartime experiences in different ways. Hayes died in 1955 at the age of 32, his struggles with alcoholism and survivor's guilt finally overwhelming him. His death brought renewed attention to the challenges faced by combat veterans and the need for better support systems for those returning from war. Gagnon lived until 1979, working quietly in New Hampshire and raising his family. He occasionally participated in ceremonies honoring the memory of Iwo Jima veterans, but generally avoided the spotlight. Bradley survived until 1994, living a full life as a businessman and family man while carrying the memories of his wartime service privately. The legacy of the flag raising on Mount Suribachi extends far beyond the 6 men who participated in that moment on February 23, 1945. The image came to represent not just American victory in World War II, but the broader ideals of courage, sacrifice, and determination that defined the greatest generation. Today, the photograph remains one of the most recognizable images in American history, a testament to the young men who answered their country's call during its greatest hour of need.